So, hello, Molly, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today to chat about your experiences and your recent book publication, A Break in the Fog. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Molly Salans. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice, and I was in this cult for 7 years from 1975 to 19, oh, now I've forgotten the dates, 1978 to 1985. Those were the dates. And it took me, I did not realize that I was in a cult until 13 years after I left. And the cult was so very secret that even after I left, I never told a soul where I had been. So once I found out that I was in a cult, then I sat down individually with each of my family members and each of my friends and told them to start to finish what had happened to me.
I imagine that must have been quite an exhausting task.
It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. I could finally free myself from this so-called secret.
Did you find that your family members had similar reactions or did they differ? Did a lot of people start to say, "Oh, well, that kind of makes a lot of sense because we really weren't sure where you'd gone"?
Most people told me they had had no idea. Um, my father, when I first joined the cult and I was living at home, he was so insightful. And he sat me down. He said, "What's going on? Where are you going?" And I said, "Nowhere. I'm my own person now. I don't have to tell you. I'm fine. Don't worry about me." But he knew something was up. And I think he was the most relieved when I told him. Yeah.
Break in the Fog is it's an exceptional book.
Okay.
I was engrossed from start to finish. It is a work of fiction, but it's based on your personal experiences. So I have so much to ask you about what is directly related to your experiences and what has either been dramatized or embellished for the sake of fiction. So I wondered if it would be okay for me to ask you about your experiences.
Yes. Of course. Yes.
The main focus of the book is around Clara. Is Clara you for hypothetically is Clara yourself in this situation?
This is such an interesting question. Clara is a mixture of me and my oldest sister. And Wendy is an exaggerated character of me. I would say I'm much more hopeful than Clara was, a lot less cynical than Clara was. And I consider Clara to be a little more powerful, wanting to rise to the top, where I had no desire to do that. I didn't even know that was a possibility for me.
Oh, this is already so interesting. So did when you were growing up, did you idolize your older sister in the same way that Wendy does in some parts of the book with Clara?
So I grew up in San Francisco proper during the 60s and 70s. I was the middle of four children. And at that time, my sister and I did not get along. I adore her now. She's one of my best friends. I love her to pieces. But at the time, we were not friends. And I think that I often wondered what would it be like from the beginning if I had had an older sister who was really watching out for me. In many ways, she was watching out for me, but I didn't take it that way because she was so. So I'm kind of a mixture of both. And my brother and my younger brother and sister didn't make it into the book. It was too many characters for me, given that this was my first novel. I had to narrow it down somehow. Yeah.
The storyline in A Break in the Fog, there's significant turmoil within the family that lends itself to the situation that Clara finds herself in later on. Does this have any similarities to your experiences in your own childhood?
So my my um my parents were not Holocaust victims, and there are no Holocaust victims in my immediate family. I know that my great grandfather escaped the pogroms in Russia. What happened in my family was so different than what happened in the book, in that my father grew up very Jewish, and my mother did not know she was Jewish till she was around 20. No, yeah, she didn't know she was Jewish till around 20 or 21. So when they got married, both of them sort of denied religion and brought in culture. So I grew up with every holiday under the sun with no meaning whatsoever. So certainly there is a culture of Jewish, the Jewish humor and thought process, but there wasn't any religion. And my father, this part was true in the book. My father was a prominent doctor in San Francisco, and he did start an adolescent clinic, the first of its kind. He worked in the heart of the Fillmore district at the time, which was just about all African American. And he really wanted to get kids off of drugs and off the streets. So he got a grant from the federal government. He started a whole adolescent clinic. He got the parking lot across the street. And at Christmas, it was a Christmas tree lot. And during the year, it was a car wash. And he got all the kids working. And he always said, you always have to have a purpose in your life. So he was not the angry doctor that's described in the book. And that came to me in a whole another way, if you want to hear that. I really wanted to make a kind, loving father, the way Atticus is oh, why can't I remember the name of the story now? Very famous book. But I couldn't. He was the conflict. And my mother was an artist and a pianist. That was all true. And she did have a mental illness of which I could never identify. She was not an alcoholic. She was not addicted to pills. Although it is true that her anxiety was very high, and my father did try to give her some medications, which she refused to take, halfway through her marriage. So she was an absent mother. And my father was more of a playful, fun father. So here we are in the heart of San Francisco, and there's absolutely no discipline in our household. And we are four kids doing whatever we want. And so my oldest sister, I find out years later, took over the discipline of the three of us. And because we were less than a year and a half apart, she decided to give me the worst. So she kind of expected and demanded a lot more from me than I resented her. She was not very kind to me. She's pretty brilliant herself in her creativity and the ways she hurt me. but but that was the household I grew up in. It was chaotic, it was artistic, it was musical, and it was scary. So the other piece I'll add is I enter high school in the heart, this is the heart of busing. So African Americans are being bused to my school, and my youngest sister was being bused to a different school. And there was absolutely no counseling, no group talk, no understanding of what was going on. And it was the heart of the civil rights in San Francisco and the rest of the nation. And the African American students were 4 times my size. I was this little kid, little white girl. And you walked into the lobby of George Washington High School, where there was a statue of George Washington. All of a sudden, black paint was being thrown over George Washington. George Washington was black. Black paint is being thrown into the water fountain. Black water represents Black power. In gym time was an absolute nightmare for me. Um, I'm growing up in high school, and at the same time, the principal of the high school is getting on the intercom maybe twice a month, maybe 3 times a month. Last night, Janis Joplin died of an overdose along with your fellow students, and here's who died of overdoses last night. No conversation about it, none. The teachers were not so, there was so much flirtation going on between male teachers and students. It was beyond belief. So I experienced high school as a very, very scary time. In addition to this, because my father was working with adolescents, sometimes maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months, the doorbell was ringing at 2 or 3 in the morning. There were kids strung out begging for my father's help. How they got the address, everything was exposed in phone books at that time. So it was a very, very scary time. Now, a part in the book where Anna, the mother, is playing the piano and the kids are outside watching, it's a free concert. That part was true. I came home one day and all these guys were all over the front steps with their guitars, stinking up patchouli oil, their long hair. Oh, wow, man, a free concert. I was 4'8" or 4'9". I was absolutely terrified. And I run in through the back door. I go around the alley and run in through the back door, and mom's at the piano. And I was terrified. I said, Mom, these guys are out there. She looked outside and she sat up really straight. Now, she wasn't high, she wasn't on drugs. She just went, oh, I have an audience. And she just kept. So I grew up in absolute terror. A lot of people in this country like to romanticize the 60s and 70s in San Francisco. For me, it wasn't a romantic time. It was absolutely terrifying.
From the things that I've read, the research that I've done, it does feel sometimes that there was a dark underbelly. There was definitely a dark underbelly, and the drug crisis was prolific, especially mostly in San Francisco because that became the echelon for the hippie movement, and there was this underbelly that as the counterculture movement began to die out, the drug dealers moved in and everybody was going from marijuana and kind of LSD to harder drugs, lots of heroin, lots of ecstasy, and things changed really, really quickly, and it kind of became like a playground for people that were distributing drugs.
It's very true. And at the same time, this was a breeding ground for cults. It was the perfect place for cults. We had the Moonies, there was a Hare Krishna, a Krishna group, there was Jim Jones, and God knows what other cults were growing up there, including the one I joined. It was just crazy. And you're
Mm-hmm.
right that it really, really got out of control very rapidly. And it kind of culminated with Jim Jones, with the 962 people committing suicide, and we're in Guinea, I think it was. Um,
Down the road in Santa Monica, you have Synanon, and then over in Laurel Canyon, Manson's with his people doing all of his stuff. So California is just the epitome. There was also the Source family as well. Like the epitome of cult creation is like California. It always goes back to the surrounding Los Angeles.
it was crazy, and it seeped up to San Francisco very quickly and got into the airports. The Krishnas were everywhere handing out roses. You know, you look so sad today. We're having a dinner. Come and cheer up. Have some good food. It was just absolutely nuts looking back on it. How anybody, well, a lot of people didn't survive that time, but how anybody did. And we had Watergate in the middle of all of that, where Nixon was caught breaking into the Democratic tapes and files and everything else. So politically, civically, and it also was following the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassinations of Martin Luther King, and the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, all with, those two within months of each other in 68. So it was a breeding ground of disaster and believe in God and come to this group, we'll take care of you, quite a breeding ground for all of that. It was
Fascinating to hear you talk about that from a first person perspective, because all I know is the research that I've done looking back on history. But it's really quite something to read all of that stuff and then have somebody say, I was there, I lived it, and I can tell you it was like this, it was like this. And the dynamics in the classroom that you mentioned, it's almost like blurred lines between professionalism, um, and positions of power being exploited. What is consent in an age where women are being empowered, feminism is on the rise, and free love is a thing that's almost become part of the social structure?
That's right. So much so that I did not graduate on stage in high school. There was no prom, there was no football team. Because this was conventional and we students just washed it out. There's just like you cannot participate in anything that's smacks of convention. So all of that was washed out, and I never joined them, but my sister did. I think my sister did. There were tea groups that the teachers formed, and these tea groups were peer confrontation groups where you would get out your anger and then you just stay mad. And it was all about trying to get your rage out. I'm not clear what they were, but one teacher in the fall accosted me and he said, "Oh, Goddess Molly, you look so beautiful today. You should come rap with me after class. My wife and I had just a beautiful daughter this summer dawn, and you should just come and rap with me because you're so beautiful." Oh my, these things just absolutely freaked me out. And this would happen in English class. A teacher sat us around in a circle and said, "We need to connect with each other before we can begin class. I want you all to look at each other in the eye and tell each other something really positive about each other." And this one student looked at the teacher and she said, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, you have the most beautiful blue eyes." And you just knew they were sleeping together, but you had no words for it, no way to describe it. It just was so, so creepy and unsafe. That's the best way I can describe it, although I didn't have those words for myself when it was happening. And I know that I wasn't the only one. And I don't know how many students at that time were actually abused, how much of it they would say looking back that they were either coerced or it actually was consensual. Because by 17, 18, I don't know that it can be, but who knows? So all of that was the breeding ground for me to find safety. By the time I graduated college, all I wanted, I was severely depressed. I was thinking suicidal thoughts all the time. In high school, I had a plan and didn't carry through with it. And it just got worse in college. And all I wanted was to be loved like anybody. And all I wanted was a real boyfriend. I wanted to get married. I was very, very hurt by the free love concept. I couldn't handle it. I needed meaning in my life, and I thought for sure a man would bring that. I wanted a baby very badly. I wanted children, and I thoroughly believed that a husband and children would take care of me. And I didn't think about career. That wasn't anything that I was encouraged to do in my family, not because My father was misogynistic, although my mother might say that he was. To us girls, he was not. But it was such a firm belief that girls just get married. They don't need a career. It was just such a firm belief growing up. And even through college, women were talking about having careers, but that I thought, oh, I don't need that. I'll have a man to support me, you know. Um, so I was depressed. I was probably clinically depressed when I graduated college and didn't know that. I knew I was depressed, didn't know I was clinically, how serious it was. And at that time, you would talk to a psychiatrist and you were given heavy duty medication or you were hospitalized. Those were the options. So that wasn't, that didn't occur to me. Right? So I'm accosted by this group of people and I'm invited to a meeting and I walk into this meeting and the Damien figure is as gorgeous as described in the book. And the men, there's equal amount, I think there were probably an equal amount of women as men who were members of the cult. Absolutely drop down gorgeous. And one begins to immediately flirt with me, and my heart's already like, oh, maybe we'll get married. This is how idealistic I was. And they were all dressed counterculturally, but in a very cool way. Like none of them had long, stringy hair. They had clear eyes. I forgot what that looked like. They didn't smell of patchouli oil or patchouli. How do you say that word? We'll have to look it up. Patchouli oil. Um, yes, they were dressed casually, but their shirts were tucked in, you know, kind of open, and jeans, and sometimes Birkenstock sandals, but sometimes socks and shoes too. It was just a very different look. And of course, the first thing I did was look at the men's hands, and there were no wedding rings. I thought I had my pick. And so, of course, that was the first deceit because they were all married and they all had children, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was a writer. Writing saved my life through high school and college, writing poetry mostly. And in my journals, every sentence began, "What is this ache in my heart? I feel so depressed. It makes me want to die. I am hurting so much." So the Damien figure begins this meeting with, like in the book, have you ever had that ache in your heart that it hurt so much you wanted to die? And the way he said it, his charisma was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. And even though he said that ache has something to do with your longing for God, all through high school and college, I was dissing God with my friends. We'd spend hours drinking coffee cups this high, dissing God because there were the Moonies, there was, you know, Jim Jones. We knew it was crazy and that this entity could not possibly exist. Oh, they're the born again Christians all over high school and college as well. So here he's saying that ache has something to do with God. And do you know, in thinking about why I joined, it was for the men and was for the promise of community. But I think there is something very deep down that knew he was telling the truth. Or perhaps it was something about everybody in that group was nodding. And this was a brand new way of thinking about that ache. So, in a very odd way, that cult experience saved my life. Because even though it was crazy and it abused the idea of God like you cannot believe, it got me interested, it got me curious about who is God and who am I and is there a soul and what if there really is something, right? And I did get married in the cult and I did have a baby. And the birth of my baby actually saved my life. I had a purpose now, and I knew I had to be better for her.
You say that it's a wild notion that the group saved your life despite everything that happened. those first few weeks, you're not subjected to horrific abuse or coerced in any way. It's the love bombing honeymoon phase of finding this new group. And a lot of the time when people talk about their initial experiences, irregardless of love bombing, there are these experiences, these out of body or otherworldly or unexplainable experiences that people have that tie them or marry them to the group uh forever, or until they have to leave to save their lives, or they slowly wake up and realize what's been happening. So I don't think it's that unthinkable that you could have that experience. You're at such a low point in your life where it really is, am I going to continue living or not? And to come across a group that is speaking to your soul almost, is a huge thing. And the utopia that people find in the initial stages of these groups is, it's the sell, isn't it? It's the sale, that's the thing that hooks you in. And then every time you think of leaving, it's what will happen if I leave? Will I be okay? Will I go back to not wanting to be here? Or you stay in the group chasing that experience. How can I get that initial experience back again? How can I? Do you feel like, maybe I'm just rambling on, but do you feel like these are any of the experiences that you had?
Absolutely. To the T. To the T. The first year I was in, I was the apple of everybody's eye. I could do no wrong. For the first time, you probably know this as a therapist, as I know this, when you run a group, people begin to play their family roles and project onto people who they think are, so that's what happened. And for the first time in my life, instead of being compared to my older sister, my younger brother, and I was less than, all of a sudden I'm being compared as, you should look at Molly. She's a new student. Look at what she's doing. And not realizing that it's the comparison that brings you up and down and has nothing to do with the truth. I'd never been built up like that. And I think my older sister can say the same thing, that perhaps she was always compared to me, but I never saw it that way, right? But in our talks over the many years, it was the same for her. So here I am suddenly like, oh my God, people are finally liking me, not even seeing, the word seeing me wasn't the word, it was people like me. Maybe I can do something well, even though I wasn't doing anything, I was just showing up for the meetings. So
A few questions that I had about your earlier life experiences in comparison to the book before we move on to Damien. Um, and I have a lot of thoughts about Damien. Um, do you feel like your father's relationship with the children that he supported, and the parentification that took place between your older sister and yourself and your younger siblings, do you think that that added to your search for something deeper, a deeper connection, or a stronger family unit?
I was definitely looking for a stronger family unit. There's no question. As I say, it was not my intention when I started out to make my father, to make Joe such a fearful, scared, PTSD, angry guy. That wasn't, I wanted to do more of a kinder, understanding father, who my father really was. But at the same time, in the community, my father was idolized. Everybody absolutely adored him. And my grandmother adored him. And I think deep down, subconsciously, it taught me I would never meet anybody like my father. And internally, looking back on it, I believe my father suffered some depression. And he could get angry unexpectedly, but it was mostly over asking for money. And I think he really struggled between, am I a father loved for being a father, or am I loved for being for my money? And I think he really, really struggled very deeply with that question. But as a kid, as a teenager, I did, because he would say, if you need anything, please ask. And the minute you would ask, he'd just blow up. So it was very hard, and it was difficult to talk with him about it. Years later, when he was much older, I was so thankful I could have that conversation with him. And as he got older and older, he became kinder and kinder and kinder. The Damien character in the cult, you're asking, was he any, he, in the fact that he was charismatic, I believe my father probably had some charisma in him. He was a very good speaker, and he was, this was it. The Damien character was so insightful. He could read anybody like this and get right to that very vulnerable point. And when my father was an unusual doctor, he wasn't a psychiatrist or even or a psychologist, but he was a cardiologist. That when he sat people down, he would talk to them, and he would take a blood pressure before and after he spoke. And he'd come home and he'd say, really, the art of medicine is to listen. That's all you need to do. So I know that his patients just loved him to pieces. I knew some of them because he was so insightful. So when I joined the cult, he often sat each of us down. So, okay, tell me what's going on. You look really unhappy these days, and I almost felt like sometimes he read my journal, but I hid it so well. And I knew he wasn't the type to go looking for it. He just knew.
He sounds like an incredible man. He really does sound wonderful, and I can see why you might think that you could never meet anybody that would live up to. um I just suppose I was wondering if during your bouts of deep depression, whether you might grow resentful of a father that is giving so much time and focus to other children that are not his children, or whether that is the child inside me who perhaps would feel that way.
No, that's a very insightful question. I think at some point I did feel that way. There's a picture of my home on the outside, and you don't really get what's going on the inside. And so as a teenager, my father and I'm just remembering this now, as you say, especially around 15, 16, he and I got into some very, very explosive fights, really explosive. It was awful. And they were far and few between, but they were horrifying for both of us. And there was never any apology about it from me or from him. And nobody came to me. My mother didn't come to me. We had babysitters, live-in babysitters at the time. None of them came to say, hey, your father's having a hard time. Nobody, I think the two of us terrified, terrified everybody. It was bad. I was slamming doors, and one day he stopped, he was at a stoplight, and I said, I'm getting out of the car, and I walked home, and I don't know how many miles home it was, but the fighting was so bad, and I really felt like he didn't have a clue as to what was going on with me. Now, given at that time I was very depressed, I was probably heartbroken. And he may have been, his kids were growing up. He had a household of teenagers, God knows. And my mother was pretty absent, and neither of them really had any idea what to do with us. So I think there is some truth to that. Everybody loves Dad. You have no idea who he is, you know, from my experience at that time. Yeah.
You mentioned that your father suffered, or may have suffered from his own form of depression as well. So there's a chance that during these arguments where you don't understand each other, you're both experiencing something with your mental health that is causing you to be unable to.
Absolutely.
Wow, isn't that hindsight is such an interesting thing, isn't it? To look back on things and say, and that makes me wonder about you and your sister now, because you mentioned being resentful of your older sister for being particularly harsh with her um trying to establish boundaries as almost the parent in the household. And I'm sure that she must have also felt resentful of her siblings because she had this role placed onto her when she was just a kid that wanted to be a kid.
By the time I entered really deep therapy, and I think I was 30 years old. And after a time, I was telling my therapist that I was the black sheep. And then after a time, she asked me, after I was telling her story after story about my sister and I, she said, has it ever occurred to you that your older sister may have been depressed too? She said, I want you, because I was going to school for therapy at the time. And she said, I just want you to look back as if you were the clinician on the two of you, looking at her behavior. What would make her do that? What would cause her? You took it inward, you hated yourself. But depression is about hatred and irritability in kids. What if she was hating the world? So then I began to develop far more compassion toward her. I began to understand that we both grew up in the same chaos, that we were both trying to do the best that we could at the time. And eventually we started to talk with each other about our treatment toward each other and what our household was like. And it was so enlightening that she was very depressed. She was very, very depressed. And we talk about this all the time now, the ways of getting out of that, how to help our kids through it, and what really happened. And it's so fabulous to have it all out in the open.
There must be some fascinating conversations where you're
Yes,
comparing how you both remember things. And
yes,
yeah,
yes.
I imagine that is something new every time you sit down together.
Right. So the in the book, the car game, I don't know if you remember that the two sisters engaged in, that was real. She really
Right.
did do that with me, among other things that I cut out of the story. But one person who read the book said that in order for Wendy to really want to find Clara, they would have had to have been close in childhood. So I had to change that part a little bit. And it was gratifying. I got to relive my childhood with my sister and go, wow, let's change the story of this.
There was a thought I had as well that I don't know if I'm going sort of way off the mark. You've spoken about the difficulties that you had with your mum and how she was somewhat of an absent parent. Is that why you decided to start the book at a point where Clara and Wendy's mum has actually passed away?
So it took me 13 years to write this novel. So it went through a million different renditions.
Wow.
And the first rendition, the first few renditions started from Clara's childhood. And it really showed Anna's absenteeism, her psychosis, and everything else. And then somebody else read the book and said, what if you made this into memory? So that person, so I tried it, I just was trying every suggestion because this was my first endeavor at a novel. I'd never done it before. I have written a book of nonfiction, but never this. So when I worked for years on creating it into memory, it seemed to work better. And so it was suggested that we begin with her gone already. And it seemed to work better than, and the whole reason for, what I'll say is that so much more deeper things came out from the memory than from real time. Yeah. that was, but my mom lived until she was almost 92, and she stayed unhealthy, mentally unhealthy that whole time, and believed she was the healthiest person in the world, and we were all crazy. So she had that up until she died.
I really thought those parts of the book, well, the whole book is I really was engrossed from start to finish, but the parts where you do go back on memories of mum is very interesting because the first half of the book is kind of like there's this three-person household that's really restrictive, kind of almost cult-like in itself. And the father establishes this really regimented, strict environment that any person would feel like they were suffocating in. Um, but the different perspectives in the chapters from various characters allow you insight into what those individuals are thinking, why that environment exists in the way that it does. So that was really interesting. And it's really interesting to hear that that's nothing like what your house was like as well. Um, how you're able to create such a convincing atmosphere in the book that is like almost the opposite of what you grew up in is quite something. And I was surprised that in the second half of the book there was tumultuous relationships between Wendy, Clara, and their mum, because when you're grieving, I think maybe it's the same as, the summer of love. People think about it with rose tinted glasses. When a person has passed away, maybe we don't think always about the difficulties that we faced with that person when they were here, and we think about what we've lost now that they're gone. But with this situation in the second half of the book, you're like, wow, it was tough when mum was here and it's still tough now that she's gone.
Yes. Yeah. Um, my mom, looking back on it, she did everything she could. When I think about her, not knowing that she was Jewish until she was 20, growing up in Christmas parades and Easter pageants and dressing up, um, and it's not that she was young in age when she got married, but I think she was sheltered. She grew up with money, and I know that she truly fell in love with my father, but I think she may have been very similar to me, thinking that a man would take care of her, that marriage was her path. And she was more rebellious than that. She really was an artist, and she thought in visualizations and music. She was very knowledgeable about music, very knowledgeable about art, as well as really good at it. And she took piano lessons, and my father was jealous of the piano teacher. So in thinking about it in the past, I can't imagine her life being married to my father. And I think to her, he probably was controlling. And he knew how to relate to us for our kids in a way she did not know how. And I've even thought that she may have suffered postpartum, both when my sister was born and then not even a year and a half later when I was born, to be pregnant right after my sister is born. Um, she may have had postpartum with me too. And I don't think that was a thing. Or if it was, it meant you were hospitalized and you took heavy duty medication. And this was smack in the middle of the 50s, where 50 housewives endured this, and they were expected to take care of the house, the cooking, and the kids. And I don't think my mother had a clue. I don't know if the innate, inborn, I'm going to protect my children thing of motherhood, I don't know that she had that. I'm not really clear. Her heart was in her music and in her art. And I think she was so very needy. She didn't pass that on to us. She tried, she engaged a lot in doing art projects with us, but my oldest sister was the only one that showed any talent. I'll give a plug for my sister. She drew the cover of my book.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. I do. I love it. And reading the book and hearing about Clara with the dancing and then seeing the picture on the front, but then finding out that you don't dance, Molly.
Well, dancing is one of my most favorite things to do.
Right. Okay. Okay. So when you said earlier that you didn't really like weren't career focused, and you weren't really interested in pursuing anything, I thought then, oh, maybe Molly didn't dance, but then of course you do.
No, that's true. Dancing, I thought, well, what if she's a writer or what if she's an artist like my sister and my mother? And I thought, oh my God, if, if I have another life, I'm going to be really gifted at dancing because I love it. I love dancing. And what happened was, my mother, the pianist, my mother, the artist, believed my piano teacher, who was also hers, when he told her I was tone deaf. So she quit. I wasn't tone deaf. I was just having trouble reading music. And she played the piano. I danced all the time when she played the piano. So she put me into the San Francisco Ballet, where all my friends were going. And I was 8 years old. And after maybe I was 9, and we were being measured and whatever for the Nutcracker. So I was very excited. My most favorite, I loved it. So the next week I go into class and 5 or 6 girls, the teacher's really paying attention to them, but she's not paying attention to the rest of us. And I asked her about the Nutcracker after class. She looked up my name and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, you were 2 pounds overweight. You didn't make the cut." So my mother didn't get mad. She just said, "Okay, don't take it, don't take dance anymore." But I absolutely loved it. And so throughout my adult life, I've taken lessons. Whenever I'm at a party, I go for it. But I didn't become the professional dancer that Clara became. That was a dream of mine, Well, what if I could really dance? What if I really went for it regardless? And ballet may have been way too restrictive for me. But and then a bit in high school, I took modern dance and enjoyed that a lot more. So that's how all that came about.
It's great to hear you and what how much of Clara is you and how much isn't, and I think it's absolutely awesome to gain this insight. And I noticed throughout the book that there were various themes of loneliness, restriction, teenage angst, ill mental health, paired with what I think everybody experiences, body image, a lot of issues around the way that people feel, and look in their own skin. Um, and all of this culminates to Clara's initial experience of this group and Damien. So you've mentioned what it was like for you having your initial meeting with this group, and then there's a part in the book that I just thought was so it was almost funny. So Clara is taken shopping by somebody who says you need to dress like this to find your true self, which is just the opposite, isn't it? You're being told by somebody how to look and what to wear, and this is what you should dress in order to be true to yourself. So I just wondered if you could talk us through your experiences after this initial meeting, um, what continued to be attractive about the group, what changed over time, and your specific experiences. Um, and then we can talk about how they relate to Clara's experiences.
Okay, so where do I begin with that? Looks were of paramount importance. Wearing jeans to class eventually was not okay. The language, we want you to dress like men and women, not like girls and boys. And that was consistently talked about. I always had a taste for clothes, so I don't believe that anybody ever went shopping for me, with me, but I had to stop wearing hippie dresses and Birkenstocks and I was even encouraged to start wearing makeup, which was something I had refused to do all through high school and college, never wore makeup. I believe somebody took me shopping for makeup, although I can't really say that was true because I don't remember very clearly, but I had no clue how to wear it. So somebody had to have taught me what to buy and how to put it on. Um, so I didn't mind dressing differently. Looking back on it, my sister and I used to steal my mother's clothes and we were always playing dress up. So that sort of became a natural, oh, I can get out of these ugly jeans. You know, I never really perhaps took to them to begin with. Um, so I had a baby in the cult. Clara never had children in the cult. I don't know where to begin with this one. So you're asking me for my experiences and how they differed. All right. Um, so in the beginning, it was amazing. And then how did it turn? I think the cult did end up moving to Boston, which is how I got there. It did encourage marriage, and so Michael and I got married. And once it moved to Boston, the Damien figure also moved, and his ex-wife, who I was also close to, we can call her Susan, also moved. So a lot of people I knew were already there. And the whole reason why we moved, which I didn't find out till I was, I realized I was in a cult, was because of the Jim Jones incident. And there, I've forgotten the names now, but I believe there was a California senator who was shot and killed trying to figure out what was going on. And so what was happening was that everything that smacked of a cult was being investigated by the FBI. And I found out years later that there had been enough ex-members who had complained about this particular cult to the police. There was a record. So the two cult leaders beat it out of California and decided to move to the East Coast. And at the time, they just dismantled the whole cult thing. And I was still engaged to Michael. And in the spring of 79, after the Jim Jones incident and after I think Harvey Milk was assassinated, we um, we were invited back to a special meeting run by the Damien figure. And he said that the cult leader had handpicked the most special people to re-begin this group on the East Coast, and would we come? So I couldn't wait. I wanted nothing to do with my family. I was getting married. I wanted a whole new life. And my father had grown up in Boston, and I had relatives there. And Michael had gone to school in Boston, and he was thrilled. He had grown up in Brooklyn, New York, so he was thrilled to move. And it was very exciting. It was like, oh, we're special. You know, I bought that hook, line, and sinker. I was probably still depressed at the time, but had some exciting things coming up, so it didn't feel that way. And it was quite a shock for me, although I didn't acknowledge it at the time. Um, Married life was god awful, although nobody told me it would be. And living in Boston became harder, being in that group, because they were starting a group in Boston and in Manhattan. We spent every spare weekend in Manhattan walking the streets and recruiting people. And it was a god awful experience. It was just draining me. I hated it. And then we'd go to meetings and were chastised for not bringing in enough people and what was wrong with us, and being singled out in a meeting. Um, and it got more and more intense. And like you say, chasing that euphoric experience became the absolute need, so that I wasn't kicked out. And Um, so in terms of actual experiences, I don't know that this would be sequential, but every summer, I think it was every summer, if not every other summer, they had a retreat in a different state, like they retreat in Oregon, and they would invite those members who are worthy of going into this retreat. I think it lasted 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. And it is true, we were blindfolded because we were not allowed to see where we were going. So once we flew into the state, we got on a bus and blindfolded for hours to get to the place that we were going to. It was true that no matter if somebody was, quote, an older student, a year, been there a year or longer, no matter what they said, they'd be chastised for it. It is true that we had absolutely no sleep on those retreats. We were up at dawn and worked our butts off, and were in nightly meetings that started at 7 and went till 4 or 5 in the morning, completely deprived of sleep, which of course is on purpose. So we were all, you go 72 hours without sleep and you're declared officially insane at that point in time. There were lots and lots, everybody was married, everybody had kids. I don't think, I don't think my daughter was born the first time I went. And the cult leader was like, give your kids sugar, give them twang. You don't have to you don't have to spend a lot of money to give them food. And at the time, we were working our butts off and asked to pay $200 a month to stay in the group. And things were being built on this retreat, free labor, and it was pretty awful. So these all night meetings were nightmares. And it would be a women's meeting and a men's meeting. And the Helen character was off her rocker crazy. And the husband, who I didn't really write about, was a psychopath. He was one of the scariest people I'd ever met in my life. And we believed them hook, line, and sinker. And during the women's meeting, a woman would be singled out for not doing her part. And all of us women were asked to participate in putting her down. So when it came to my time, I had been in the cult 2.5 years, and I did have my child with me. I think Sarah was 2, and she was crying a lot, as all children are. They're very sensitive, and most likely she was picking up on the energy, and I had no sleep. And there was a daycare at the retreat, and I never got to see her. Working in the kitchen, I forget all the chores I had, cleaning cabins people were sleeping in. It was just one thing after another. So I probably never saw her. And during that women's meeting, she wasn't necessarily a mentor. This was Damien's ex-wife. I was very, very close to her, the woman I'm calling Susan. And the cult leader was there, and she started in. She said, Molly, I really think you weren't meant to be a mother. The way your daughter is behaving in the daycare, she's crying a lot, she's tantruming, she's throwing things. You're really doing a lousy job. So from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, by every woman there, I was told that I wasn't meant to be a mother. And that wasn't I lucky, because I had this group of women who could parent my daughter for me. And what was common in this group was that children were swapped all the time. That part was true in the book. The cult leader would just say, you're a lousy mother, your kids belong with this person. And the kids were swapped back and forth like as if they were, products, things. And because I was so insecure, and because obviously my depression had never left, it was bounding back in leaps and bounds without my knowledge. And I believed, because, being a mom, when somebody says you're not doing something right, especially when your kids are young, it's like, oh, they're probably right. I have no idea what I'm doing. Right. So they were able to work on the most vulnerable part inside me. At that time, I forgot, at that time, Michael had left the cult. And when you leave the group, you're not allowed to talk to the person who left. And I wanted to stay. So he left when she was an infant. I forgot about that part. And I stayed, and I was considered a hero for staying, and that he would come back or that I would meet someone else. And we weren't allowed to talk, but I thought that was nuts. I broke that rule right and left. He was her father, and he adored the baby. So there's no way I was going to keep him out of her life. But in this meeting, by the end of it, they had convinced me that Susan should fly back to Boston with Sarah, that she would look in on Michael to make sure he was a good father. And if she determined that he wasn't, she'd take her. So the cult leader ends up calling Michael at 4 or 5 in the morning. I'm in tears. I'm a wreck. And she says, Susan's going to take Sarah, the baby, home. And Molly is an unfit mother. And we want to make sure you're doing well with Sarah. So Michael knew how to swear. When he was angry, you didn't want to be around him. And I could hear him swearing. I wasn't sitting that far away from the cult leader, but I could hear him just going off. And she hands me the phone, and he said to me, if you're not on the plane with our child, if somebody else is on the plane with our child, I will make sure that the police are at the airport waiting to arrest that person. He said, when I come to pick up Sarah, she looks at you, she gives you a really big hug. She comes to me. I've never seen a bruise on her. She's 2, she's going to tantrum, Molly. If you've read any about books of child rearing, of course she's tantruming. What 2-year-old doesn't? She's in a foreign environment. And he said, she's in a shitty fucking environment. Why wouldn't she be? He said, you need to get out of there. So we circumvented that problem, but I was shattered. That shattered me. And you would think I would leave at that time. But what does the cult leader do? A few months later, but she introduces me to a guy who I completely fall in love with. So now everything is redeemed for a little bit of time.
I have to ask you this question, Molly, because it can't possibly be that, and I can cut this part out if it does happen to be true, but it can't possibly be. Was Damien named Alex Horn?
I cannot answer that question.
I can't believe it. I cannot believe it. Oh my goodness me. Oh my goodness me. I am like on the brink of tears right now. That is absolutely wild. When you know what happened to other people in New York and Boston, and you can trace that back to the 2 people moving because they were outed as cult leaders to those areas. Oh my gosh, Molly.
So we may have to cut this part out. And I will tell you that I spoke with somebody yesterday because I was on the verge of telling the truth. And he said, you need to get legal counsel. Don't do anything until you have legal counsel.
So I interviewed Spencer Schneider about his experiences with Sharon Gans, and he is a Manhattan lawyer. So I just can't believe I was writing notes when you were talking about the subscription and the secrecy and the shunning of members and the kind of behind closed doors adoptions. And I was thinking in my head that there is no way that this could be the same group. That is absolutely wild.
Well, he told I reached out to a lawyer today because he told me he wouldn't do it. And he said it would be unsafe to name the group, not because they'll come after me, but because I've called the book fiction. And now I'm saying, well, no, it was actually based on this. But I've also said that it's loosely based on my experiences. And so I don't know what to do with this. This is why I'm seeking legal. It's not necessarily Alex Horn, but somebody else in that same group. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I can't believe that. Wow, I can't believe that.
I can't believe you know about it, but of course you would have introduced interviewed Spencer. Absolutely.
I absolutely cannot believe that. I speak to Spencer every week. He's like a really good friend of mine. We communicate. Yeah, he's a patron. Yeah, I wrote a review for his book that's in the publication. Yeah, we talk like weekly.
Oh, you're kidding.
That's why I'm so shocked. And that's why a minute ago when you were talking, I was on my phone because I was trying to find out the location that Alex and Sharon moved from because I was trying to connect those dots. I absolutely can't believe that that is.
That's it. And I just found out about Spencer on Thursday and I reached out to him yesterday and we had an hour and a half conversation. I wish he would represent me. He said no. He has his own legal counsel. And I am dying to make this known, but he said because I'm calling it fiction, I need to be careful. He said if you name Sharon and Alex, they're dead, but you can't name the people who are alive. And I don't know if he's named more people who are alive, but
Wow. Oh my goodness. Because then there's Esther Friedman, who was part of the Boston branch that came after Spencer's New York branch, but your branch came before these two. So the dots that you and Spencer must be able to connect is just absolutely blowing my mind right now. I can't believe it.
he didn't know the group in California. I mean, this is crazy that the connection here is beyond anything I would have ever understood.
Yeah. When you were talking about the retreats and the manual labor and the subscription fee and the secrecy and how you were recruited in the first place, everything fell into place at that point. And I am absolutely lost for words. Even the name in the book, which is not the name of this group, I thought, oh, that it rings of this other group.
Yes. Yes. Oh my God. I cannot believe this. Wow. This is amazing. I told Spencer that I was on my first podcast today, yes, yesterday, but I didn't tell him who it was
If you
with.
would have told him it was me, he'd be like, "Oh, it's the best podcast in the world." Yeah, he bigs up the show to everybody. He bigs it up to everybody. I'm gonna message him right now.
Yes, tell him give him a big hello and I will do the same. If so, ask him again if I can say yes, this is the same group.
There is so much to go into. This is wild. I am familiar with this particular person's MO around taking children, giving other people's children away to other people, unofficially, uh, privately or illegally. So I am really glad that it had the rational effect on you rather than the cult effect on you, and you were able to.
For some reason, the cult leader called Michael. Now, I don't know if there had already been lawsuits against them for her to do that because she didn't have to do that. I would have given Sarah to Susan because I was so brainwashed and so completely and absolutely shattered that I would have done that, except that Michael would have had to have met them at the airport and then that could have created, maybe she thought that through, or she's just loony. Um, but other things, happened there. She introduced me to somebody that I fell madly in love with. He was in New York, I was in Boston. I met his family. I adored him. And then I guess I was kicked out for bad behavior, for negativity, or whatever it was, at the point where I was crazy with love for him. And then the male cult leader kicks me out for um I can tell you, I think it was that time. I'm trying to remember. I was kicked out twice, and the second time I didn't go back at the height of my love for this person. So then we weren't allowed to talk to each other, and I called him. He said, "Don't call me anymore." And then I begged to get back. And by the time I got back 6 months later, it was on a retreat, and he had been introduced to somebody else. And it completely shattered me because I was going back for him. And then, people surrounded me and said, you got to cut it out. It's over, blah, 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 blah. And I couldn't get over it very well. But then he was kicked out. And I think he and this other woman broke up. I'm trying to remember all the sequences of it. And he was in New York and I was in Boston. And I think I tried to contact him and he wanted nothing to do with me. So I think a year and a half went by. And then the cult leader called me at home. This was very unusual. The woman called me and she said, he's gone missing. We don't know where he is. And he was rising to the top at that point. And he said, we don't know where he is. And I said, well, I haven't talked to him for a year and a half. I have no idea where he is. And the cult leader said, well, you need to call his parents and find out what happened to him. And you need to tell them that he's been coming up to see you and he missed a time and you can't get a hold of him. So, terrified to say no, I called his parents, who I hadn't talked to for 2 years, and I really liked them. And they said, well, he's been taking money out of his account. And I said, oh, that's because he's been coming to see me. And they were both on the phone. They both felt quiet because I had no idea how much money he was taking out of his account. And then she said, well, he was found walking the streets of Manhattan and he's now in a mental hospital. So the cult broke him down. Highly intelligent, really passionate guy. And the cult completely broke him down. And when I called the cult leader to tell her that, she told me I was a fucking liar. I said, and then his friends called me and said, that can't be true. I said, call his parents. Maybe they're lying. You call them now. Bombard them, see how they feel, you know. So the David character is fashioned after the guy I love so much, but I was never coerced into sex ever. I know that there have been reports of very deep sexual abuse. Lots of physical abuse went on in meetings. One guy was, I'll just call them Philip and Jim. Philip wasn't doing his job. And so Jim got up and punched him in the nose right in front of us. And they got into this sprawling fight. And the Damien figure, who is not who you think it was laughing and just said, good job, Jim. See, Phil, you really had to get the shit knocked out of you. Men were encouraged to beat up their wives for not behaving. I was in one meeting, a group meeting, where a guy named Matt was divorcing his wife and they had kids. And he was saying, she's asking for all this money and I just don't have it. And the woman cult leader said to him, oh, just start sleeping with her again. She'll give you everything you want.
She's such a misogynist. For a woman, she is was such a misogynist of the deepest, most depraved.
Oh, she was absolutely crazy. And it was true that during one meeting, when she came to visit, it was like the Queen of England is coming. Everything had to be clean to the utmost. The altar had to be such. She had to have her whiskey, her coffee. And she was not like Helen, but she was very, very elegant. And she'd walk in. And then at one point, she turned her back on us and she had a piece of Kleenex in her hand. And the Damien figure was like, you guys are making her cry. She loves you so much and you have no questions for her. Well, if anybody asked a question, they were completely demolished for asking it. It was a stupid question. Don't you have anything better to ask her? So we were all severely punished for making her cry. She'd come all this way from New York just to give us all of her love and answer as many questions as she could. Yeah, so I was not only hit by Michael, and we ended up divorcing anyway. It was a very bad marriage. And then I started running the daycare center, and I was socked in the face by my cohort. I was not doing my job. I wasn't clean enough. I mean, you could eat off the floor. And she hit me in the face a few times. And I was just like, I have to. And then by 85, I'd had enough and I was just shattered and done. And oh, that was the summer I was on the retreat. And in the very beginning, we were studying particular people, and I had a gift of memorizing and I had a gift of speaking, which I didn't know at the time. So I was able to memorize these passages and just say them from my heart because they were spiritual in nature. And one thing the cult did do for me was bring out my longing to know God. It was just very weird. We studied a lot of different spiritual people, and they appealed to me. So what the work I was doing appealed to me. And then that last summer I was there, apparently nothing I did was helping the energy. Everything I did was negative. So I was sent into solitary confinement. And I was there for 3 days, and people brought me food and brought me wood for the fire. And I think my daughter was with me, and I had enough things. I was finally able to spend time with her. So it was good for us, just like when Clara was sent to solitary confinement. And then when I came back into the meeting, I had memorized another passage, and I said, I'd like to, I have a poem or whatever it was, an essay I'd like to recite. And the male guy who's just looked at me and he said, you've already started this all wrong. This isn't yours. This was the author's. How dare you own it? Get out of here. Get out of here. And I was so devastated by his rage. And the meeting was ending, and I was going to go. I didn't have very much to do with him. This was not the Damien character. This was the cult's husband. I really didn't have a whole lot to do with him. I just heard about how harsh he could be. And I'd seen it in meetings, but it had never been directed at me. So I was going to go up to him to say, of course I didn't know that wasn't mine. But he kind of went into this frozen position. And all of these men kind of circled him and faced me, protecting him. I will never forget that image. It was the scariest thing I'd ever seen and felt in my life. And then as I was packing up to go home, the women who I thought I'd made friends with were still yelling at me for making such a horrible mistake after having all this time away. And I just turned to one of them and I said, it's easy to beat a horse when it's already beaten, isn't it? And I wanted to say, this is what we all do to each other, but those were my last remarks to her. And so I was still pretty brainwashed. I thought that the cult leader knew about children and knew how to raise them. So I was still calling and asking about what I should do with my daughter. There are certain questions I had. She was going to turn 5 in November, and I wanted to enroll her in kindergarten. Was it okay? Should I wait a year? And in the end, I followed my own heart and enrolled her. And then the freedom of not having to go out at night, of not to recruit people, the freedom of not having to find a babysitter. I had absolutely no money because it had all gone to the cult. There was a point where they were traveling to Israel for something, and we had to pay for 20 people's airfare, hotel fare, food, and tours. Um, I was just flat out broke the entire time I was there. And then to be able to have money, even if I didn't have any savings, to keep my checks and to keep the money I was earning, and to get my mind back and to understand, to find a therapist. But I was sworn to such secrecy that I never told my therapist I was in this group. Never. I was in therapy every day for every week for 7 years to get myself back. But I never told her I was in a cult because I didn't know at the time that I was. And I never talked about the group. It was so deeply ingrained that this was a secret. And there's such a sense of loyalty within me. It's one of my deepest traits. And maybe there was some shame involved to say anything. And maybe I needed all that time to recover. And my ex and I stayed friends, and we raised our daughter together. And when we were driving her to school in New York when she was 18, or on the way back, I asked him if he had ever had nightmares, if he was still having nightmares about this group, because I was still having nightmares. And that's when he told me he was in a cult. We were in a cult, and that's when he told me he was having an affair the entire time we were married, because that's what the male cult leader encouraged: have affairs, do whatever you want, lie to your wife. She doesn't have to know these things, be a man. So it was a lot of psychological and physical abuse, a lot. And the physical abuse was just laughed at. This woman punched me. I didn't even tell people that I was punched because it was so embarrassing. It was so shaming. And I didn't want anybody to know. So I left. I got my life back together. At the encouragement of my therapist, I went back to school. I became a therapist and found out I was in a cult. And around that time, I had a client who I really liked, and she came back in to see me. And she told me she had joined this secret school and that they had told her she was very negative and that she needed to see a therapist. And my mouth dropped. And I asked her, I named the people in the group, and I asked her if this was the same group, and she was very, very surprised. I said, everything you tell me is confidential. Do they know you're seeing a therapist? She said, yes. I said, do they know you're seeing me? She said, yes. I said, that's hugely surprising. I would leave before you're kicked out. And I know you. And if a stranger asked me to describe you, the last word, I wouldn't even begin to describe you as negative. Maybe you have some depression, but I would never call you negative. And everything they're telling you is a lie. And I told her the truth. I said, I started that group and I'm not proud of it. And if you want to know more, I'd be happy to meet with you and tell you more, but get out of there as fast as you can. And she did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So a lot of strange things happened when I was writing the book. At first, I was writing things exactly as they happened, and I joined an adult ed writing class in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so at this time, I was telling everybody I was in a cult, including Steve Hassan, who's a world, Steve. And I had read his book, and I had known him personally just briefly for a little bit of time. So I decided to call him and tell him that I was in a cult and which one. And he said, "Oh, funny enough, I'm debriefing somebody from that cult right now. Do you want to come to a session?" I said, "Hell yes." And then in that moment, like 2 or 3 days later, a week before I'm supposed to go into the session, Susan calls me. Now, one thing that we did in this cult was we wrote a lot. And I love to write poetry. So I think I wrote a paper, I think I wrote some poems, and the male cult leader told me I was the worst writer that had ever lived, and that I was not honest, and that I needed to really get in touch with my true self before I could ever write again, and to read Susan's work. I can't prove it. I didn't keep her writings, but I think she plagiarized the Psalms and put her name to them and handed them in. They were, because they were, I didn't read the Psalms, not till later. I get dabbled here and there, but they were familiar to me. And I thought, I wonder if Susan played. So Susan calls me and she says, and I was so shocked to hear from her. It'd been years and she'd been kicked out. And I'm told now she's running the group. And so Susan said to me, "I hear you're writing again." And I said, "What?" She said, "I hear you're writing again. And I just wanted to touch base with you." And it scared me so much because somebody in that class was not only actively in the group, but had known the history of San Francisco. So I called Steve. I said, "Oh my God." And he said, "Invite her to the meeting." I said, "No, no, 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 no. You don't know who Susan is. You don't want her at the meeting." And so when I went to the meeting, the guy who was being debriefed said, "I just want you to know you don't have to worry about anything that you're writing because I'm pretty at the top, and I'm trying to get the woman I love out of there. And once we're out, the whole structure is going to collapse and they're going to have to redo it all. And they're really going to be concerned about the restructuring of the cult and not about your writing." So I quit the class and didn't stop writing, but it was pretty shocking.
I can't believe the direction that this conversation has gone in today. I really didn't expect it to take these twists and turns.
I did not either. And um, I don't know what else I can say about that
Yeah.
experience. Kids were really being swapped right and left, and they still are, as far as I know. I went to an ex-member meeting years later, and there was one of the women who said, "Oh yeah, my kids went over to their house and stayed there for a year, and then they came back with the other kids." And she seemed a little psychotic and talking about it like, how can that not make a mother crazy to keep swapping your kids like that? I was just like,
So, such a wild thing that's happened. In the book, A Break in the Fog, it's really towards the end that the dramatization, fictionalized version of events starts to take place, and there's a crescendo of events, um, as is typical with psychological thrillers, that happens, and that is really why I think people should pick up a copy of this book and read it. It is it's amazing to read a memoir and to read people's first person experiences, and to kind of live life through the eyes of the author as they recall their memories, but with a fictionalized version of a cultic experience. All of those things that we understand, cult terminology and tactics, methodologies, it's all there, but you also have the added kind of altering of reality that comes with getting lost in a fictional book. So, of course, memoir has its merits, and I love reading people's memoirs, but I also do enjoy fiction from time to time because escaping from reality is one of the perks of reading fiction. And I also do realize the parallels with escape and reality is also one of the reasons why people might often get swept up in cults. I not that has not gone over my head, I realize as I say it. But the ending of A Break in the Fog is just completely something else. I was not expecting it. I was trying to think, how is this gonna end? And so people really do need to pick up a copy to just read the whole story and and understand why the book has been so greatly received. So I wondered if you could just tell the listeners, how has the book been received?
Well, it did win first an award for first place for best historical fiction, a psychological thriller and suspense. I was not expecting that, and I was so thankful to receive it. And I have very beautiful reviews on my website for anybody to look at. There's some really wonderful reviews on Amazon. I'm available for book clubs. If you listen to the podcast, but if you want to know more, I'd be really happy to come to your book club. I won't charge you for that. Yes, and all 5-star reviews, of course, are welcome on Amazon. I love to read those, and I would also love to hear about other people's experiences. I am a psychotherapist. I do love to listen to these stories because this book seems to have hit people on all types of levels, on the mental health level, on the addiction level, on the cult level, where some people who have been in abusive relationships, not necessarily a cult, because Steve Hassan did teach me that you can be in a one-person cult as well as in a group cult. Families, as you know, Casey, can be cultish, but so can an abusive relationship that becomes way too controlling, where you don't have your own life anymore. And one thing I do want to say about this cult, which I believe is true for cults in general, is they are really, really clever at making you let go of your family. And that's the first clue of, oh, you don't need to see your mother tonight, or you're always talking to your sister, give that time to me. These types of things are hints that you're starting to be into a controlling relationship. And it happens so subtly that you don't even realize it just makes sense. So yeah, I don't need my mom. In the cult, it was like, be men and women, don't be boys and girls. Why are you still relying on mommy and daddy? And the Damien character was particularly good at going way into your doubts and your hatred of your family around. I'll never forget when the Damien character just singled me out around, why do you hate your parents so much? And I was like, well, my father and I fight, but I don't hate him. He goes, well, what about your mother? And I just started crying because there was so much there with her too. And he got me. He just got me as one of the most understanding people in the world. And I'm much more aware now, thank goodness. And I'm very happy to say that I'm confident enough to talk about this, to write about it. It was a real blessing to finally explore it for myself because, as I say, I was having clients, and all of the work I was doing on myself and with my clients just really led me to a need to write this story. And I felt like fiction would be the safest way to do it and far more interesting. Although, I've been thinking about writing this up too in bits and pieces about my real experiences to go along with what was here. And hopefully with the lawyers, okay, I'll be able to name the cult. And if that can happen before this is aired, I'll let you know. And then maybe you don't have to cut all this out.
Wow, yeah, wouldn't that would be something. It would be interesting for listeners to hear sort of unedited mad reactions to things. And also to pride myself on how much knowledge I have gained in my 3 years
Yes.
of doing this work. I've impressed myself today.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I'm very impressed because I thought this was one of the lesser cults. And it was so funny because on Thursday I was on a walk and I keep asking, who else has been in this cult? Who else can I talk with about this? I really want to name it. And then on my walk, I just Googled the cult and up came Spencer's name. And I emailed him yesterday morning and he responded. And we talked just yesterday afternoon for the first time. And
He's just
then,
told me he's just ordered your book.
tell him thank you. I will text him after this. Wow.
He said, she suffered a lot, but she's a strong and smart woman, is what he just said.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Oh, Spencer. I always call him Stephen. So I wish he would represent me, but I think because he's written his own, maybe it's a conflict of interest and he can't. Um, I've written to a lawyer out here in California, and I was thinking of writing him and asking him who his lawyer is, and I don't know if it matters where I'm located.
I don't know if you can see this picture, but this is Esther. She was part of the Boston group. She was brought in. So I would say that this story is now in 3 parts, right? There's you at the beginning, Spencer in the middle in Manhattan, and Esther at the end in Boston.
Oh, Esther's more recent.
She was. So I've got interviews with Spencer and Esther on the show. And then I've got an interview with Spencer and Esther where they compare their experiences, which was quite cool.
So Esther named the cult.
Yeah, she's written a book about it as well, but it's not published yet. I
Uh-huh.
think she's planning to self-publish it in a couple of months.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, I don't know when Esther joined because I left in 1985. So I had just moved to Boston in 79 and it wasn't called what it was. There was no name for it at that point in time. So that must have happened habitually a lot with her. But it would be really fun to be on a podcast with Spencer and Esther and I, if I can.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I would love that. It was 2006, it's 2006 that she got involved and then left in 2011. But that's oh, it's what so it really is beginning, middle, and end because Spencer was in for 20 odd years and he was kind of slotted in the middle of that. Oh,
Wow. Well, I'm going to work on this more and more to get legal counsel and to see, because Spencer was saying, but you're calling it fiction. And I said, but it's on the back cover. This is loosely based on my experiences. And people are asking. So I wonder if I can get around that. Yes, it's fiction. And I wouldn't have been able to write it so well if I hadn't experienced a cult
yeah.
myself. So
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see what we can do. It'd
Yeah,
be,
it's definitely it's definitely worth looking into. I would absolutely love that.
and I'll get legal counsel and see what I can do about this because people keep asking, and I really don't think it's important. However, having it out today has felt so good to me. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, now you just have to write a memoir. That's all you have to do. Just write a memoir. Just
There you go. I could probably do that now. Maybe that is my next story is to write up the what really happened. Um,
wow. Oh my goodness. I'm just looking here. Esther's got a website and all sorts of stuff, and Spencer's got a cult blog where he writes stuff. And yeah, you can listen to our episodes, and I wonder what your reaction would be listening to them. And
I will look for the episodes with Spencer. I'll text him after this is over. Unbelievable.
it's so funny that you just said I've got an interview tomorrow, but you never mentioned who it was with. Because if you would have said that, we never would have had that moment, that aha moment in this interview, because you would have already known that I would have known.
It's just better that way that you were able to connect the dots and figure it out. And I could stand amazed. It's just better this way because it just brings up, oh, I only knew about Spencer on Thursday, right? You've known him all this time, and here the three of us are connected in the last 2 days. It's crazy. Last 24 hours, really. Oh, it's so funny.
So, A Break in the Fog is your most recent publication, but you do have other pieces that have been printed. So, can you please tell the listeners about your other writing as well?
So in 2004, Jessica Kingsley Publishers in London, England, I don't think they're called that anymore, published my first book of nonfiction called Storytelling with Children in Crisis. And at the time, I was working for an agency and I was doing home-based crisis intervention and going into the homes of impoverished children and working with them and their families. And at the same time that that was happening, I was taking classes in storytelling because I was going around to open mics and discovering that I had a gift for reading poetry and telling stories, not necessarily my stories, but story like fairy tales and legends and researching things. So I decided to, with one family, I had learned from this one storytelling class how to elicit stories from people. So I sat down this one kid who was particularly difficult, and I just started to tell him stories because I didn't know what else to do. And he became very, very interested in the stories. And then there was one day where I walked in, I was at a new home, and I think the 5-year-old answered the door and let a perfect stranger in, and mom was sleeping, and he had a couple of younger siblings, and cereal was spread all over the counters, and the 5-year-old kept climbing up to get cookies. It was a mess. What was I supposed to do? I was thinking of leaving, but I just sat down at the kitchen table and started practicing a story that I was going to tell. And the kids came around, what princess you talking about? Why are you talking to yourself? So I said, sit down and I'll tell you a story. And they were fascinated. And then I learned how to elicit original stories from the kids. And eventually, moms were listening outside the room and wanted to contribute. So I compiled a book together of the stories I told these families and the stories the families told back to me. And then I changed the endings of those stories and said, well, what if you thought about it this way instead? And it turned into this lovely book. I do have the rights back and I do plan to republish it. You still can get it on Amazon. It's a little bit more expensive right now, but at some point soon, I hope I will reestablish that book. It's a lovely book and I'm very, very proud of it. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. And A Break in the Fog is an award-winning psychological thriller fiction book that is available today on all platforms. I was lucky enough to get my copy in the post. Thank you very much, Molly. And I will make sure that I put links to all of your work in the episode description. And you do have a website as well, I believe.
Yes, at breakingthefog.com. Please visit it, read the reviews. And there's a click to Amazon to buy the book. If you would prefer it to buy it from me directly, shoot me an email and I will send you a signed copy and a written note, a handwritten note. So if you want to buy it from me directly, please just shoot me an email at abreakinthefog@abreakinthefog.com.
That's wonderful, lovely. And we will be featuring A Break in the Fog as the May monthly memoir book of the month. So if you join in with the giveaway, there's a chance you might just win a copy. So you should head over to social media and do that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There will be a giveaway for that. Absolutely. Yes.
So thank you so, so much for your time today, Molly. Thank you for sending me a copy of your book, for taking 13 years to put it out in the world, and for allowing us to see just what can be developed in fiction through your lived experiences, which were absolutely, definitely not fiction. and to be able to piece all parts of the cultiverse together and recognize totalist systems when they are being spoken about in the Vegas terms. And I really feel like I've had an affirming experience during our interview today. And as I said, was engrossed in A Break in the Fog from start to finish. And by the end of it, I was kind of left a little bit like, oh my goodness, kind of like exhilarated but really stressed at the same time, which is what you want when you are looking at escapism. So thank you so much for that and for your time today. I appreciate you and your work.
Thank you so much, Casey. Perhaps we can stay in touch too. It'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care, Molly, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.